The chains around her wrists felt heavier than iron as Delilah Pearson stood on the glass platform, rotating slowly beneath spotlights that made her skin look translucent and her bruises glow like watercolors beneath the surface. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a full meal or slept without nightmares. The auction house hummed with voices, some human, most not. They spoke in languages that predated nations, their eyes reflecting light in ways that defied biology. Vampires. Dozens of them, dressed in clothing worth more than her entire neighborhood, discussing her like she was livestock. In their world, she supposed she was. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, his accent crisp and British despite the Eastern European setting. Female, 23 years old, AB negative blood type. No diseases, no addictions, no family to complicate ownership. Certified healthy by our medical staff. We'll start the bidding at 50,000 euros. Delilah's stomach twisted. She'd known this was coming for 3 weeks, ever since the collectors had dragged her from the Prague hostel, where she'd been staying during her gap year trip. She'd thought she was so worldly, so independent, traveling alone through Europe. She'd thought monsters were metaphors. 60,000, someone called from the back. 75. Another voice countered, female and sharp. Delilah tried to focus on breathing. The glass platform continued its mechanical rotation, giving every vampire in the circular chamber a perfect view. The room itself was stunning, all dark wood and crimson velvet, with chandeliers that dripped crystal like frozen tears. It could have been beautiful if it weren't a prison. 100,000, a new voice bid, and several vampires turned to look at the speaker. 150. Someone else snapped back almost immediately. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. We have 150. Do I hear 175? Delilah's legs trembled. She'd been standing for over an hour, watching other humans sold before her. Some had cried, some had screamed. The ones who'd been through this before just looked empty, resigned. She refused to be any of those things. If she was going to die, and she probably was, she'd die as herself. 200,000. A voice cut through the murmuring crowd, and the entire room fell silent. Delilah's platform completed another rotation, and she saw him for the first time. He sat in a private box on the second level, partially shrouded in shadow despite the ornate lighting. But there was no mistaking what he was. His skin was pale as moonlight, his hair a cascade of white that fell past his shoulders. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than the auction house itself, and even from this distance his eyes caught the light like a predator's in the dark. Lord Peregrym, the auctioneer said, and his voice carried a tremor of fear wrapped in professional courtesy. An honor to have you bidding this evening. 250,000, another vampire called out quickly, clearly trying to challenge the newcomer. The white-haired vampire Lord Peregrym leaned forward slightly, and Delilah felt the temperature in the room drop. 500,000, gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the auctioneer looked stunned. 500,000 euros, he repeated slowly. Do I hear 600,000? The female vampire from earlier interrupted, her voice defiant. Delilah's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't understand what was happening. She wasn't special. She was just a girl who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another stupid American tourist who'd wandered down the wrong alley. Lord Peregrym stood, and the movement silenced every whisper in the room. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, and moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost choreographed. When he spoke again, his voice carried without shouting, each word precise and cold as a knife. 2 million euros. The room erupted. Vampires turned to each other, speaking in rapid bursts of languages Delilah couldn't identify. The auctioneer's professional mask cracked, revealing genuine shock. The female vampire who'd been bidding against him sat down abruptly, her expression caught between fury and fear. 2 million, the auctioneer managed. Going once, no one spoke. Going twice. Delilah stared at the vampire in the box. He stared back, and she felt pinned by that gaze like a butterfly on display. There was something in his eyes she couldn't read, something that wasn't hunger or cruelty or possession. It almost looked like purpose. Sold, the auctioneer declared, bringing his gavel down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Lot 47 to Lord Peregrym Illyrius, Vampire King of the Northern Courts. Vampire King. Delilah's knees nearly gave out. She'd been bought by royalty, by someone important enough that other vampires feared him. She didn't know if that made her situation better or infinitely worse. Guards approached the platform, human guards, she noticed, wearing expressions of careful neutrality. They unlocked her chains with swift efficiency and guided her down the steps. Her legs felt like rubber after standing so long, and she stumbled. One of the guards caught her elbow. Walk straight, he murmured in English, keeping his voice low. Don't look at any of them except him. He paid for exclusivity. Delilah wanted to ask what that meant, but they were already moving through the crowd. Vampires watched her pass with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hunger to something darker. She kept her eyes forward, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. They led her through a side door and down a corridor lined with more velvet and dark wood. At the end waited another door, this one guarded by two more vampires, also pale, also white-haired, but lacking the otherworldly presence of the one who'd bought her. The guards handed her off without ceremony, and one of the vampire guards opened the door. Inside was a private room that looked like it had been decorated for old-world nobility. Heavy curtains, antique furniture, a fireplace that crackled with real flames. And standing by the window backlit by the glow of Prague's nighttime skyline was Lord Peregrym Illyrius. Up close, he was even more striking. His features were sharp and aristocratic, his white hair tied back loosely at the nape of his neck. He still wore the black suit, but he'd removed the jacket, revealing a vest and white shirt beneath. When he turned to look at her, his eyes were a shade of gray so pale they were almost silver. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs near the fireplace. It wasn't a command exactly, but it wasn't a request either. Delilah remained standing. She was terrified, exhausted, and furious in equal measure, and she refused to obey him like a trained dog. One of his eyebrows rose slightly. "You've had a difficult evening." "Sit." "Why?" she asked, and was surprised her voice came out steady. "So you can drain me more comfortably? So I won't make a mess when I collapse?" He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her shock, he moved to the other chair and sat himself. "My name is Peregrym Illyrius," he said calmly. "You may call me Peregrym. I hold the title of Vampire King over the northern courts, which includes territories across Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and parts of Russia. I am approximately 800 years old, though I stopped counting precisely sometime during the 16th century. And I did not purchase you to drink from you." Delilah blinked. "Then why did you spend 2 million euros on me to free you?" The words hung in the air between them. Delilah waited for the punchline, the catch, the trap. When none came, she shook her head slowly. "That doesn't make sense. Nevertheless, it's true." Peregrym leaned back in his chair, looking relaxed despite the tension crackling through the room. "These auctions are illegal even by vampire law. They're run by a coalition of rogue vampires and human traffickers who exploit a loophole in our legal code. I've been working to shut them down for years, but the organization is vast and well protected. Raiding this location would have resulted in significant casualties, both vampire and human, and the survivors would simply relocate and continue their operation elsewhere." "So you're what, a vampire cop?" Delilah couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. His lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "I'm a king. I enforce our laws and protect our people. But I also recognize that humans caught up in this system are victims, not commodities. By purchasing you at such an exorbitant price, I've sent a message to the auction house and every vampire present tonight. Their profit margins have shifted. Their business model becomes unsustainable if they must compete with my resources." Delilah finally sank into the chair, her legs giving out more than her resistance breaking. "You crashed their market, essentially, yes. And in the process, I've secured your freedom." "Freedom." She laughed, and it came out slightly hysterical. "I'm in Prague with no money, no passport. They took everything when they grabbed me and no way to prove I'm even alive. The American embassy probably thinks I'm dead or voluntarily disappeared. My parents," her voice cracked. "God, my parents must be losing their minds." Something shifted in Peregrym's expression, a softening around his eyes. "I have people who can handle the documentation. By tomorrow evening you'll have a new passport, enough money to book a flight home, and official documentation explaining your disappearance as a kidnapping with recovery. Your embassy will be notified through appropriate channels. You'll be able to contact your family within 24 hours. It sounded too good to be true. Delilah wanted to believe him so badly it hurt, but 3 weeks in captivity had taught her to trust nothing. "What do you get out of this?" she asked quietly. "What do you want from me?" Peregrym was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Delilah think of centuries rather than years. "I want nothing from you except for you to survive and return home safely. Consider this restitution for the crimes my kind have committed against yours. Why do you care? You're one of them. I am." He didn't deny it, didn't offer excuses. "But I am also responsible for my people, and that includes ensuring they don't prey upon yours indiscriminately. We have laws, treaties, systems in place to maintain balance. Those who run these auctions violate every principle our civilization was built upon. They endanger both species." Delilah studied him, trying to reconcile the monster who'd bought her with the man who was promising to free her. "You really mean it? You're just going to let me go? After ensuring your safety?" "Yes. She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. Why me specifically? There were other people at that auction. I couldn't purchase them all without making my intentions obvious and alerting the organization to my strategy. But you. He paused, and something unreadable crossed his face. When you stood on that platform, you weren't broken. You were terrified but defiant. You reminded me that survival sometimes looks like simple refusal to surrender. I thought perhaps you deserved the chance to continue surviving. The tears won, spilling down Delilah's cheeks. She wiped at them angrily. I'm not usually such a mess. You've endured 3 weeks of captivity and just been sold at auction. I think tears are appropriate. A laugh bubbled up despite everything. It was absurd sitting in a luxury room with a vampire king who'd just spent a fortune to set her free, crying and laughing at the same time. But nothing about the past 3 weeks had made sense. So why should this? What happens now? She asked when she'd gotten herself under control. Now you sleep. There are private quarters attached to this room. The door locks from the inside. He stood, moving toward a door she hadn't noticed before. I'll remain out here. In the morning, my people will bring documentation and arrangements for your return home. You have my word that you're safe. Delilah stood as well, swaying slightly. Exhaustion was catching up to her now that the adrenaline was fading. The word of a vampire king. The word of someone who understands what it means to be imprisoned against your will. There was a story there, something dark in his past. Delilah wanted to ask, but she was so tired she could barely stand. Instead, she nodded and moved toward the door he'd indicated. She paused at the threshold. Thank you, Peregrym. He inclined his head in a gesture that was purely aristocratic. Sleep well, Delilah Pearson. She didn't ask how he knew her full name. At this point, it seemed like the least mysterious thing about him. The bedroom beyond was smaller but no less luxurious than the main room. A massive bed dominated the space, covered in dark linens that looked impossibly soft. Delilah locked the door as instructed, then collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. She expected nightmares, expected to lie awake replaying the auction, but sleep claimed her almost instantly. She woke to sunlight streaming through gaps in the heavy curtains. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came back in a rush: the auction, the vampire king, the promise of freedom. Delilah sat up slowly. Her body ached from weeks of poor sleep and worse conditions. But for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt rested. Someone had left a tray of food on the nightstand while she slept: fresh fruit, bread, cheese, coffee that was still somehow hot. Her stomach growled loudly. She ate quickly, then explored the room more thoroughly. Someone had also left new clothes: simple jeans, a sweater, comfortable shoes that were actually her size. There was a bathroom attached, and she took the longest shower of her life, scrubbing away 3 weeks of fear and grime. When she finally emerged back into the main room, Peregrym was gone. In his place sat a woman who was definitely human, dressed in professional business attire and surrounded by documents. Good morning, Miss Pearson, the woman said in perfect English with a slight British accent. My name is Sarah Chen. I work for Lord Illyrius's administrative staff. I have your documentation here. Delilah approached cautiously. Spread across the table were papers that included a passport, an embassy report, police documents, and what looked like witness statements. Sarah walked her through everything efficiently. According to the official story, Delilah had been kidnapped by a human trafficking ring and held for 3 weeks before being recovered in a police raid. Several witnesses had given statements. The embassy had been notified. Her parents had already been contacted and told she was safe. Your mother is expecting your call, Sarah said gently, handing Delilah a phone. Take your time, I'll wait outside. Delilah's hands shook as she dialed. The phone rang twice before her mother answered. Hello? Mom, Delilah whispered, and then she was crying too hard to speak. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Her mother cried. Her father got on the phone and cried. Her younger brother even cried, which he never did. They wanted her home immediately. They'd already booked her a flight for that evening. When Delilah finally hung up, she felt hollowed out and simultaneously more whole than she'd been in weeks. Sarah had returned and was waiting patiently. There's a car ready to take you to the airport, Sarah said. Your flight leaves at 7 p.m. That gives you several hours to rest or see the city, if you prefer. Though I'd recommend rest. Where's Peregrym? The question escaped before Delilah could stop it. Sarah's expression remained neutral. Lord Illyrius is unable to travel during daylight hours. He asked me to convey his best wishes for your safe journey and hoped that you might recover from this ordeal quickly. Of course, vampires and sunlight. Delilah felt stupid for forgetting. She hesitated. Can I at least write him a note? Or something? Sarah's professional mask cracked slightly, showing surprise. I'm sure he would appreciate that. She produced paper and a pen. Delilah stared at the blank page, trying to figure out what you wrote to a vampire king who'd saved your life. Finally, she scribbled a few lines. Peregrym, thank you for my life. I don't know how to repay this debt, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worth what you spent to free me. I hope your crusade against the auction houses succeeds. Maybe we'll meet again someday under better circumstances. Delilah, she folded the note and handed it to Sarah, who tucked it away carefully. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The car ride to the airport, the waiting, the flight home. Delilah slept through most of the journey, too exhausted to do anything else. Her parents met her at the airport with tears and fierce hugs. Her father wouldn't let go of her hand the entire drive home, the official story held. Police followed up with interviews, but the documentation Peregrym's people had provided was airtight. After a few weeks, the attention faded. Delilah's life slowly returned to something resembling normal, but she couldn't stop thinking about him. She tried. She went back to college, threw herself into her classes, saw a therapist to work through the trauma. She told herself it was just gratitude, just the natural connection between a victim and rescuer. She told herself she was being ridiculous, fantasizing about a vampire who'd shown her basic decency when she'd needed it most. It didn't help. 3 months after Prague, she still dreamed about silver eyes and white hair, and a voice that spoke of centuries. She started researching vampires obsessively. Most of what she found was nonsense, folklore and fiction blended together until the truth was impossible to extract. But occasionally she'd find something that rang true. References to vampire courts, mentions of old laws, and several references to the northern courts and their enigmatic king who'd ruled for centuries. 6 months after Prague, Delilah was working at a coffee shop near campus when a man in an expensive suit walked in and approached the counter. He was human but had the same carefully neutral expression as Sarah Chen. Delilah Pearson, he asked quietly. Her heart jumped. Yes? He handed her an envelope. From Lord Illyrius, no response needed. Then he left before she could ask questions. Delilah waited until her shift ended to open the envelope. Inside was a single card with an address in New York City and a handwritten note in elegant script. If you ever wish to learn more about the world you briefly touched, come to this address after sunset on any Thursday evening. The choice is entirely yours. Delilah read it 17 times, her hands shaking slightly. He was offering her answers. Or maybe he was offering more than that. She told herself she wouldn't go. It was insane to walk back into the vampire world voluntarily. She'd escaped once, that was miracle enough. But Thursday evening found her on a train to New York City, the card clutched in her hand like a talisman. The address led to a building in Manhattan that looked like it had been transplanted from Victorian London, all stone and wrought iron, completely out of place among the modern skyscrapers. A doorman was waiting and he nodded when she approached. Mrs. Pearson, Lord Illyrius is expecting you. Of course he was. The doorman led her inside to an elevator that descended rather than climbed. Down and down, far below street level, until Delilah's ears popped from the pressure. When the doors finally opened, she stepped into another world. The space beyond looked like a palace carved from stone and shadow. Vaulted ceilings soared overhead, supported by columns that appeared medieval. Candles and electric lights competed for dominance, creating an atmosphere caught between centuries. Vampires moved through the space with that distinctive fluid grace, all of them pale and striking, all of them watching her with varying degrees of interest. This way, please, the doorman said, seemingly unbothered by Delilah's wide-eyed staring. He led her through several corridors to a set of double doors. He knocked once, then opened them and gestured for her to enter. Peregrym stood by a fireplace in what appeared to be a study or office. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes that looked ancient and probably were. He was dressed more casually than in Prague, black trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, but he still radiated that same presence. When he turned and saw her, something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, but something warmer. Delilah, he said, and hearing her name in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. I wasn't certain you'd come. I wasn't certain either, she admitted, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about everything you said. I needed to understand. Understand what? Why you did it, why you cared, why you're inviting me here now. Peregrym gestured to 2 chairs near the fireplace, and this time Delilah sat without resistance. He took the opposite chair, and for a moment they just looked at each other. In Prague, I told you I purchased your freedom to disrupt the auction house's business model, he said finally. That was true but incomplete. I also did it because when I saw you standing there, refusing to break, I felt something I haven't felt in a very long time. What? Hope. You reminded me why we fight to maintain the treaties between our kinds, why the laws matter. Why not every vampire is a monster and not every human is merely prey? You reminded me that sometimes the right choice is also the difficult choice. Delilah's throat felt tight. You spent €2 million for hope? I've spent far more on far less meaningful things over the centuries. He leaned forward slightly. I sent you that invitation because you deserve the truth about the world that touched yours. Because you have questions that deserve answers, and because I found myself hoping you might want those answers. I do, Delilah said immediately. I want to understand everything. What followed were hours of conversation. Peregrym explained vampire society with a patience that surprised her: the courts, the laws, the treaties with human governments. He told her about the long history of his kind, the wars they'd fought among themselves, and with humans, the fragile peace that currently held. He was honest about the darkness too, about vampires who viewed humans as nothing but food, about the constant struggle to maintain order. Delilah listened, asked questions, and slowly began to understand the massive hidden world that existed alongside her own. The auction houses, she said eventually. Have you made progress shutting them down? Peregrym's expression darkened. Some, the Prague location, closed permanently. 3 others have followed. But the organization adapts quickly. It's frustrating work. I want to help. He went very still. Delilah, I'm serious. You saved my life. Let me help save others. It's dangerous. The vampires who run these operations wouldn't hesitate to kill you if they discovered your involvement. They already tried to sell me once. I'm not afraid of them anymore. That wasn't entirely true, but Delilah forced confidence into her voice. I understand their systems from the inside. I know how they treat prisoners, how the auctions run, what humans experience. That's valuable intelligence. Peregrym studied her with those unsettling silver eyes. You would do this voluntarily, return to that world? To tear it down? Absolutely. Something like admiration crossed his face. You're remarkable, do you know that? Delilah felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm angry. There's a difference. Anger can be remarkable when properly directed. They talked through specifics. Peregrym had a network of informants and agents working to track the auction organization. Delilah's testimony and insights could help them understand patterns, predict locations, identify weaknesses. It wouldn't be without risk, but it would be meaningful. By the time Delilah left, the sun was nearly rising. Peregrym walked her to the elevator personally. Come back next Thursday, he said. We'll continue this work. And Delilah, he paused. Thank you for trusting me enough to return. Thank you for giving me something to fight for. The elevator doors closed between them, but Delilah felt his gaze on her until she rose out of sight. Thursday became the highlight of Delilah's week. She'd finish her classes, take the train to Manhattan, and descend into the underground court. Sometimes they worked, poring over maps and reports. Sometimes they just talked, sharing stories about their vastly different lives. Delilah learned that Peregrym had been turned during the 13th century by a vampire who'd seen potential in a young soldier. He'd spent centuries learning control, building power, eventually claiming leadership of the northern courts, through a combination of strength and political maneuvering. He spoke matter-of-factly about events that belonged in history books, about wars and plagues and empires rising and falling. She told him about growing up in suburban America, about her parents and brother, about dreams of traveling the world that had been derailed by 3 weeks in captivity. She talked about the nightmares that still woke her sometimes, about the fear that she'd never feel completely safe again. He listened to everything with absolute focus, as if her ordinary human life was as fascinating as his centuries of existence. 3 months of Thursdays passed, then 6. Delilah started staying later, leaving closer to dawn. Peregrym walked her to the elevator every time, and each farewell felt harder than the last. She was falling for him. The realization hit her one evening when he laughed at something she'd said, a genuine, unguarded laugh, and her heart had performed acrobatics in her chest. She was falling for a vampire king who was 800 years old and could probably have anyone he wanted. It was completely insane. She tried to pull back, to maintain professional distance. But Peregrym seemed to notice the shift, and he became more careful too, keeping space between them that hadn't existed before. The tension grew unbearable. Finally, after one particularly long evening of deliberately not addressing the elephant in the room, Delilah couldn't take it anymore. Why did you really invite me here? She asked abruptly, interrupting Peregrym mid-sentence about surveillance footage. He went quiet, his expression carefully neutral. I explained that when you first arrived. No, you gave me reasons, but they don't explain why you keep inviting me back, why you spend hours talking to me every week, why you look at me like. She cut herself off, suddenly terrified of finishing that sentence. Like what? His voice had gone soft, dangerous in a completely different way than before. Like I matter, Delilah whispered. Like you see me as more than just a human you once rescued. Peregrym set down the papers he'd been holding with precise, careful movements. Then he stood and crossed to where Delilah sat, stopping just close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. You do matter, he said quietly. Far more than is wise. Far more than I intended when I first sent that invitation. Her heart was racing. What does that mean? It means I've lived for 8 centuries without feeling what I feel when you walk into this room. It means I count the days between Thursdays like a mortal counting down to something precious. It means I am falling in love with you, Delilah Pearson, and I have no idea what to do about it. The world tilted. You're falling in love with me? Is that so surprising? You're a vampire king. You're 800 years old. She gestured helplessly. You're you. I'm just a college student who got kidnapped. You're a woman who stood on an auction platform and refused to break. A woman who came back voluntarily to fight against the organization that imprisoned her. A woman who makes me laugh and challenges my assumptions and reminds me why immortality can be a gift instead of a curse. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were cool against her skin. You're extraordinary, and I'm terrified of how much I want you in my life. Delilah's breath caught. I'm terrified, too. I've been falling for you for months, and I kept telling myself it was impossible, that you couldn't possibly feel the same way. I do. The certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. But I need you to understand what that means. I'm immortal, and you're human. I'll watch you age while I remain unchanged. Unless what? He hesitated, and she saw real vulnerability in his expression. Unless you chose to become like me. But that's a choice I would never make for you. A conversation for much further down the road if we even reach it. For now, I just need to know if you're willing to try this despite all the complications. Delilah stood so they were on more equal footing, though he still towered over her. I'm willing. I'm absolutely willing. But I need you to understand something too. I'm young and human and probably going to make mistakes. I'm going to age, and my life is going to move at a completely different pace than yours. This is probably the most illogical relationship imaginable. Logic is overrated. She laughed, surprised by his bluntness. Says the 800-year-old vampire king. Says the man who's wanted to kiss you for the past 3 months and has been too concerned with propriety to act on it. Well, Delilah said, stepping closer until only inches separated them. Maybe it's time to reconsider your position on propriety. Peregrim's eyes darkened, and then his hand cupped her face with infinite gentleness. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. When his lips finally met hers, Delilah felt electricity race down her spine. The kiss was soft at first, almost reverent. Then Delilah rose on her toes, pressing closer, and Peregrym made a sound low in his throat that was entirely undignified for a vampire king. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against him as the kiss deepened. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, though Peregrym didn't technically need to breathe, Delilah felt dazed. That was, she started. Inevitable, Peregrym finished. We've been circling this for months. I thought you might be disappointed. Humans must seem so ordinary to vampires. He laughed quietly and pressed his forehead to hers. Delilah, you could never be ordinary. Not to me. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other. Then Peregrym sighed. It's nearly dawn. I need to get you to the surface. Right. Vampires and sunlight. Delilah had almost forgotten that particular complication. They rode the elevator up in comfortable silence, fingers intertwined. At the door, Peregrym pulled her close for another kiss that left her dizzy. Come back Thursday, he murmured against her lips. Try and stop me. The next few months were simultaneously the best and most complicated of Delilah's life. She and Peregrym continued their Thursday meetings. But now they were less about work and more about learning each other. They talked about everything: her childhood and his centuries, her dreams and his regrets, the strange reality of loving someone from a completely different species. The physical aspects of their relationship progressed slowly. Peregrym was constantly aware of his strength, terrified of hurting her accidentally. But gradually they found their rhythm. His coolness against her warmth, his immortal patience and her human urgency, somehow balanced each other perfectly. Delilah started spending entire weekends in the underground court. Peregrym gave her a suite of rooms adjacent to his own quarters. She met other members of his court vampires who served him with fierce loyalty. Some were friendly, some were wary of the human in their midst, but all respected Peregrym's claim on her, because that's what she was, whether they'd officially acknowledged it or not. His. The possessiveness should have bothered her. Instead, it made her feel safe in a way she hadn't since Prague. 7 months into their relationship, things came to a head. Delilah was alone in her suite when 3 vampires she didn't recognize entered without permission. They were different from Peregrym's court. Their hair was dark instead of white, their presence aggressive rather than controlled. "So this is the human pet the Northern King keeps," one of them said, circling her like a predator. "We've heard so much about you." Delilah's heart hammered, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Peregrym will kill you for this intrusion." "Peregrym isn't here. He's in a council meeting. We made sure of that." The vampire grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. Delilah tried to pull away, but he was impossibly strong. Terror flooded her system, memories of the auction house, of being helpless, of being prey. "Let her go." Peregrym's voice cut through the room like a blade. He stood in the doorway, and his presence filled the space with barely contained rage. His eyes had gone completely silver, glowing with predatory fury. The vampires released Delilah immediately and backed away, but they didn't flee. "My lord," one of them said with mocking courtesy, "we were just introducing ourselves to your companion. You entered her private quarters uninvited. You touched what is mine without permission." Peregrym moved forward, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I would tolerate this? We thought you'd gone soft, keeping a human pet. We wanted to test that theory. And your conclusion?" The vampire hesitated. In that moment of uncertainty, Peregrym moved. He was a blur of motion, and suddenly one of the intruders was pinned against the wall, Peregrim's hand around his throat. "My conclusion," Peregrym said quietly, and his voice was more terrifying for its calmness, "is that you've made a catastrophic error in judgment. That human is under my protection. She is mine, and anyone who threatens her answers to me." He squeezed, and the vampire gasped. The other 2 tried to intervene, but suddenly the room was full of Peregrym's guards, blocking their path. "Take them to the cells," Peregrym ordered without looking away from the vampire he held. "Send word to the southern courts that 3 of their ambassadors attempted assault on my protected human. Let them explain this diplomatic incident." The guards moved swiftly, dragging the 3 vampires away. One of them shouted threats, but they died in his throat when Peregrym finally looked at him with those glowing silver eyes. Then they were gone, and Delilah was alone with Peregrym. He crossed to her immediately, his hands moving over her arms, her face, checking for injuries with frantic care. "Did they hurt you? Tell me truly." "I'm okay, scared but okay. You got here in time. I felt your fear through." He cut himself off, looking frustrated. "I should have anticipated this. There are factions that disapprove of my relationship with you, that see your presence as weakness. I should have increased security." Delilah caught his hands, stilling their anxious movement. "Peregrym, look at me. I'm fine. You protected me. But if I'd been seconds later, you weren't. And those vampires are going to face consequences, right? Severe ones. I'll make sure everyone in every court knows what happens when someone threatens you." The possessiveness in his voice should have been alarming. Instead, it made Delilah feel cherished, protected, claimed in a way that transcended logic. "I love you," she said suddenly. "I know we haven't said it officially, but I do. I love you completely." Peregrym went very still. Then he pulled her close, wrapping her in his arms like he could shield her from the entire world. "I love you too," desperately, devotedly. "For however long you'll have me." They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other. Eventually, Delilah pulled back enough to see his face. "Those vampires said something about me being your pet. What do they actually think I am to you? My consort, if we're being formal. My partner. In vampire society, that's a recognized position with legal protections and political implications." "Legal protections?" "Anyone who harms you answers to me personally. Anyone who disrespects you disrespects my authority. It's why those 3 will face serious consequences. They didn't just threaten a random human, they challenged my sovereignty." Delilah processed that. "So I'm basically vampire royalty by association?" "Essentially, yes. Though the formal ceremony requires mutual blood exchange and public declaration. I haven't suggested it because that ceremony is permanent and I didn't want to pressure you." "Permanent how?" Peregrym hesitated. "It creates a bond between us. Not like turning you, you'd remain human, but you'd carry a trace of my blood, my protection, my presence. We'd be able to sense each other's emotions across distance. You'd live longer than normal humans due to the blood bond, though not immortal. And breaking the bond would be excruciating for both parties. So vampire marriage, essentially, yes." Delilah considered this. They'd been together for 8 months. In human terms, that was fast to be considering marriage. But Peregrym had lived for 8 centuries. 8 months was nothing to him, and she couldn't imagine her life without him anymore. "Ask me," she said. "What?" "Ask me properly. The whole formal vampire thing." Peregrym pulled back to study her face. Delilah, are you certain? This isn't a decision to make in the aftermath of an attack. I'm certain. Those vampires were right about one thing: your relationship with me puts you in a complicated position politically. But if I'm formally your consort, that complication becomes official policy. It might actually make things simpler. You're thinking strategically. I'm not sure whether to be impressed or concerned. Be both. Now ask me before I lose my nerve. Peregrym took both her hands in his, and his expression was utterly serious. Delilah Pearson, will you consent to become my bonded consort under the laws of the vampire courts? Will you accept my protection, my blood, my eternal devotion? Will you stand beside me for as long as your mortal life allows? Yes, Delilah said without hesitation. To all of it, yes. The ceremony happened 3 nights later in front of the entire northern court. Delilah wore a dress that made her feel like she'd stepped out of a Gothic fairy tale, deep burgundy velvet with intricate silver embroidery. Peregrym wore formal court attire that was somehow both medieval and timeless. The ritual itself was surprisingly simple. They stood before the assembled vampires, and Peregrym spoke formal oaths in a language that predated nations. Then he produced a ceremonial blade, ancient and beautiful, and made a small cut on his palm. He offered his hand to Delilah. She'd been warned about this part. She took his hand and drank from the wound, just a few drops. The blood tasted like metal and ice and something indefinably other. It burned going down, and then warmth spread through her entire body. When she completed her part, Peregrym used the same blade to make a tiny cut on her palm. He brought her hand to his lips and drank in turn, his eyes never leaving hers. The moment his lips touched her blood, Delilah felt something snap into place inside her chest. It was like a door opening, and suddenly she could feel Peregrym's emotions tangled with her own: his love, his pride, his fierce protectiveness, all washing over her in waves. His eyes widened, and she knew he felt the same connection flowing in reverse. "It is done," announced the vampire who'd officiated. Delilah Pearson is recognized as bonded consort to Peregrym Illyrius, vampire king of the northern courts. Let all courts bear witness. The assembled vampires erupted in applause that was more formal than enthusiastic, but no one protested. Peregrym pulled Delilah close and kissed her in front of everyone, which apparently wasn't strictly protocol, but no one seemed surprised. When they finally broke apart, Delilah was laughing. "Well, I'm officially in too deep to back out now." Having second thoughts, not even for a second. The celebration lasted through the night. Delilah met representatives from other courts, accepted congratulations from vampires who were centuries old, and tried not to be overwhelmed by the surreal reality of her life. She was bonded to a vampire king. She could feel his emotions like a constant hum beneath her own thoughts. She wore a formal mark on her hand where they'd exchanged blood, and every vampire in the room could see what she was now. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt right. As dawn approached and the celebration wound down, Peregrym took her hand and led her to his private chambers. They'd shared space before, but this felt different, more permanent, more real. "How do you feel?" he asked once they were alone. "Strange. Connected to you in a way that's hard to describe. Is this normal? The bond is settling. It will feel more natural over time." He pulled her close, and she felt his contentment through the connection. "I can feel your emotions too. You're happy." "I am. I know this is complicated and probably insane by human standards. But I'm happy. Then I consider this the greatest success of my 800-year existence." They made love that night with the bond humming between them, each sensation amplified by feeling the other's pleasure in addition to their own. It was overwhelming and perfect, and left them both breathless. Afterwards, lying tangled together in Peregrym's massive bed, Delilah traced patterns on his chest and thought about the impossible journey that had brought her here. From an auction platform in Prague to the private chambers of a vampire king. From terror to trust to love. "What are you thinking?" Peregrym murmured, his fingers combing through her hair. "That if someone had told me a year ago I'd end up bonded to a vampire, I would have thought they were insane. And now? Now I think maybe insane isn't always bad. Sometimes insane is just loving someone despite all the logical reasons not to." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I'll take insane if it means keeping you. You're stuck with me now, bond and all, exactly as I planned." Delilah smiled and let herself drift towards sleep, secure in Peregrym's arms and the bond that tied them together. Outside, the sun was rising over New York City. But down here in the darkness, wrapped in the presence of an immortal who loved her, Delilah felt safer than she'd ever felt in the light. The next few months brought changes. Delilah finished her college degree while maintaining her position as Peregrym's consort, a balancing act that required careful scheduling and a lot of coffee. The bond made the separation easier. She could always feel him even when they were apart, a constant reminder that she was loved and protected. The work against the auction houses continued. With Delilah's insights and Peregrym's resources, they managed to shut down 4 more locations. Each success felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, like taking back power from the organization that had tried to steal her humanity. Not everyone in vampire society approved of their relationship. There were murmurs from older courts, complaints about tradition and propriety. But Peregrym handled each challenge with the same quiet authority that had first attracted Delilah to him. He made it clear that anyone who questioned his choice of consort questioned his rule, and no one was willing to push that particular confrontation. Delilah's parents struggled with the situation more than she'd anticipated. She couldn't tell them the whole truth. "I'm bonded to a vampire king" wasn't a conversation that went well, but she introduced Peregrym as her boyfriend, and they reacted about as well as any parents meeting a man who was clearly much older and infinitely more sophisticated than their daughter. "He makes you happy?" her mother asked during a private moment at a family dinner Delilah had insisted on hosting. "He makes me happier than I knew I could be," Delilah answered honestly. "Then I'll try to be happy for you. But sweetheart, he's so intense, and there's something about him that's almost frightening. He's protective, and yes, he's intense. But he's also kind and patient, and the best thing that ever happened to me." Her mother studied her for a long moment. "You've changed since Prague. You're stronger now, but also harder somehow. Like you've seen things you can't talk about." "I have, but those things led me to Peregrym, so I can't regret them." Eventually, her parents accepted what they couldn't change. Her brother thought Peregrym was intimidating but cool, which was probably the best endorsement possible from a 19-year-old. A year into their bond, Peregrym took Delilah to his territory in northern Scandinavia. They stayed in a castle that had been his home for 4 centuries, a massive stone fortress that overlooked forests and mountains, and looked like something from a fantasy novel. "This is where you grew up? As a vampire, I mean?" Delilah asked, exploring the ancient halls with wide eyes. "This is where I became who I am. I claimed this castle in the 15th century after the previous owner challenged me and lost. I've ruled the northern courts from here ever since. It's incredible, terrifying and beautiful at the same time." "Rather like its owner?" Peregrym suggested with a hint of amusement. "Exactly like its owner." They spent 2 weeks in the castle, and Delilah fell in love with the wild landscape and ancient atmosphere. Peregrym showed her his extensive library, his collection of artifacts from centuries of existence, the dungeons where prisoners were once kept. He introduced her to the permanent staff, a mix of vampires and humans who'd served his household for decades. One evening they stood on the battlements watching the northern lights dance across the sky. Delilah leaned against Peregrym's chest, wrapped in his arms and a thick coat against the cold. "I want to show you something," Peregrym said quietly. He led her to a tower she hadn't explored yet. Inside was a room that had been converted into something like a gallery. The walls were covered in paintings, sketches, and photographs spanning centuries. All of them showed the same figure, Peregrym himself, captured across his long existence. "This is how I've changed over the years," he explained. "Or rather, how I've remained mostly unchanged while the world transformed around me. I kept these as reminders of time passing." Delilah studied the images, tracing his face from medieval paintings to Renaissance sketches to Victorian photographs to modern portraits. His features were consistent, but his expression changed, younger and more naive in the early images, gradually hardening into the controlled mask she'd first met in Prague, and finally softening again in the recent photographs. "You look happier in these newer ones," she observed, pointing to a photo from just a few months ago. "I am happier. You brought warmth back into a very cold existence." Delilah turned to face him. "What happens when I get old and you don't? When I'm 70 and you still look like this?" It was a question she'd been avoiding, but standing in this room full of Peregrym's unchanging history made it impossible to ignore. "I'll love you exactly as much at 70 as I do now," Peregrym said without hesitation. "Age is irrelevant to me. I've lived through centuries. What matters is your mind, your spirit, your essence. Those don't diminish with wrinkles, but I'll die eventually. Probably in 50 or 60 years, even with the blood bond extending my life. And you'll continue for centuries more. How do you bear that?" His arms tightened around her. "I try not to think about it. I know it will destroy me when you're gone. I've accepted that. But I choose decades with you over centuries without you. That's the trade I've made, and I'd make it again." "Have you ever turned anyone, made them immortal?" "Twice, centuries ago. Both times ended badly. The change broke something essential in them. I swore I'd never do it again. Even for me? Especially for you. I love your humanity, Delilah." Your mortality gives you urgency and passion that immortals lose over time. I won't steal that from you, even if it would let me keep you forever." Delilah felt tears prick her eyes. "That's probably the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. It's simply the truth." They stood together in the tower as the northern lights continued their dance outside, talking about the future they'd have together and the one Peregrym would face alone. It was bittersweet and beautiful and hurt in all the ways that deep love always hurts. But Delilah wouldn't have changed it for anything. 2 years into their bond, the auction house organization made one final, desperate move. They'd been systematically dismantled by Peregrym's campaign, and the remaining leadership decided to send a message. They sent assassins after Delilah. The attack came during daylight while Peregrym was confined to the underground court. Delilah was at her parents' house for her brother's graduation. The assassins were human-hired mercenaries who didn't know or care about the supernatural elements of their contract. But they'd underestimated 2 things. First, Peregrym's guards had been shadowing Delilah constantly since the bonding ceremony. Second, the blood bond meant Peregrym felt the moment her fear spiked. Even in his daytime rest, the guards intercepted the assassins before they reached the house. The fight was brief and brutal. 1 assassin died. The other 2 were captured and delivered to Peregrym's court for interrogation. Delilah didn't even know about the attack until her phone rang with Peregrym's call. "You're safe," he said without preamble, and she could hear the barely controlled terror in his voice despite his attempt at calmness. "The threat has been neutralized, but I need you to come to the court immediately. I'm sending a car." "Peregrym, what happened?" "I'll explain when you arrive." "Please, Delilah. I need to see you." The drive to Manhattan took forever. By the time Delilah descended into the underground court, the sun had set and Peregrym was waiting by the elevator. He pulled her into his arms the moment she appeared, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You're safe," he repeated against her hair. "You're safe. I'm fine. I didn't even know anything happened until you called. The auction organization sent assassins to kill you. They wanted revenge for our campaign against them." His voice was ragged. "I felt your fear through the bond even during my day rest. I woke unable to protect you, unable to reach you. Do you have any idea how that felt?" Delilah pulled back to see his face. His silver eyes were wild, his expression caught between relief and lingering terror. "But your guards protected me and I'm here now. I'm safe." They could have succeeded. If my guards had been seconds slower, if the assassins had been more skilled, I could have lost you while trapped underground by the sun. But you didn't lose me. Peregrym cupped her face in his hands. "This has to end, the organization, the threat, all of it. I won't risk you again." What followed was 2 weeks of intensive vampire justice. The captured assassins were interrogated and revealed the location of the auction organization's central leadership. Peregrym assembled a coalition of courts. Even the southern vampires who'd sent the 3 intruders agreed that the auction houses violated too many laws to ignore. The raid happened on a Tuesday evening. Over 50 vampires from multiple courts descended on a compound in Romania, dismantling the final stronghold of the organization. The human leadership was turned over to Interpol through carefully orchestrated anonymous tips. The vampire leadership faced trial under their own laws. Delilah wasn't allowed to participate. Peregrym refused to risk her again. But she watched the reports filter in through the court's communication network. Every auction house shut down. Every prisoner freed. Every leader captured or killed. When Peregrym finally returned 3 days later, he looked exhausted in a way she'd never seen. Vampires didn't get tired easily, but apparently leading a multi-court military operation across international borders took its toll. "It's over," he told her, pulling her close. "Every major cell has been destroyed. It will take them decades to rebuild if they even try, and every court is now watching for signs of resurgence. You did it. You actually ended them. We did it. Your testimony and insights made this possible. Those people we freed tonight owe their lives to your courage." Delilah felt tears slide down her cheeks. "How many?" 47 humans recovered from various holding facilities, all being processed for safe return home or relocation if they prefer. "We also freed 13 vampires who'd been captured for illegal blood sport, 47 people who won't be sold at auction, 47 people who get to go home because of you." They held each other in the middle of the court, surrounded by vampires who were celebrating their victory. Delilah thought about the girl she'd been 2 years ago, standing on a glass platform in Prague, terrified and alone. She thought about how Peregrym had paid everything to set her free, and how that single act had cascaded into saving dozens of other lives. "Thank you," she whispered, "for paying my price, for starting all of this. Thank you for being worth every euro." 3 years into their bond, life settled into something resembling routine. Delilah graduated from college and started working with Peregrym full-time, helping manage the administrative and humanitarian aspects of his court. She became the bridge between vampire and human interests, using her unique perspective to navigate issues that arose. She also started a foundation dedicated to helping human victims of supernatural crimes, a way to extend the work they'd begun with the auction houses. Peregrym funded it entirely, and within a year they'd helped over 200 people recover from traumatic encounters with the darker elements of vampire society. Her parents never fully understood her life, but they saw her happiness and made peace with what they couldn't comprehend. Her brother visited the underground court once, decided it was the coolest thing ever, and had to be sworn to secrecy about everything he'd witnessed. Delilah's relationship with Peregrym deepened with every passing month. The bond between them matured, becoming as natural as breathing. She could feel his presence constantly, a warm hum of awareness that told her he was near, that she was safe, that she was loved. They traveled together when his duties allowed, visiting his various properties across the Northern Territories. He showed her the world from a vampire's perspective, secret courts hidden beneath ancient cities, gathering places that had existed for centuries, the hidden architecture of a civilization that lived in shadow. In return, she showed him the world through human eyes, simple pleasures like coffee shop visits and movie nights, the joy of experiencing things without the weight of centuries making everything feel repetitive. She reminded him how to be spontaneous, how to laugh at stupid jokes, how to exist in the present instead of being trapped by memory. 5 years into their bond, Peregrym took her back to Prague. They visited the building where the auction had taken place, now abandoned and scheduled for demolition. They stood in the empty room where he'd first seen her, where he'd paid €2 million to change both their lives. "Do you regret it?" Delilah asked. "Any of it?" "Not for a single moment. You?" "I regret the 3 weeks of captivity. But everything after? Everything with you?" "Never." He kissed her there in the empty auction house, and it felt like closing a circle. They'd begun here in terror and gold, and they'd transformed it into love and partnership. On their way out, they passed the glass platform where she'd once stood. Delilah paused, looking at it. "I was so scared," she said quietly. "I thought my life was over." "It was beginning," Peregrym corrected. "You just didn't know it yet." "Neither did you. I knew the moment I saw you that you were extraordinary. I just didn't know you'd become my entire world." They left Prague hand in hand, the past finally settled, the future spread out before them like a promise. Years continued to pass. Delilah aged slowly due to the blood bond. At 35, she looked barely 30. At 40, she could have passed for her early 30s. The bond extended her life significantly, though both she and Peregrym knew it wouldn't make her immortal. They didn't talk about her eventual death. Instead, they focused on the time they had, decades together, that were more valuable than Peregrym's centuries of existence before her. They built a life that spanned 2 worlds, vampire and human, finding balance between his immortal obligations and her mortal perspective. Delilah became respected in vampire society in her own right, not just as Peregrym's consort, but as someone who'd proven her worth through intelligence, courage, and dedication to justice. Courts that had initially dismissed her as a human novelty came to value her insights and diplomatic skills. She also maintained connections to the human world, visiting her family regularly, keeping friendships from college, refusing to let herself be consumed entirely by Peregrym's universe. He encouraged this, understanding that her humanity was precious and needed to be preserved. At 45, Delilah's parents passed away within months of each other. She grieved deeply, and Peregrym held her through every tear. He couldn't truly understand the pain of losing parents his own death, and turning had severed those bonds 8 centuries ago, but he tried. He gave her space and time and unwavering support. "I'm afraid," she admitted one night after the funerals, "afraid of leaving you the same way. Afraid of the pain I'll cause you when I'm gone." "Don't think about that," Peregrym said gently. "Don't waste our time together worrying about the end. We have years yet, probably decades, given the bond's effect on your aging. Let's fill them with life instead of death." So they did. They traveled extensively, visited every corner of Peregrym's territories, met with courts across Europe and Asia. They continued the Foundation's work, helping hundreds of humans navigate the aftermath of supernatural trauma. They made love and argued and laughed and built a partnership that transcended every rule about how vampire and human relationships supposedly worked. At 50, Delilah looked 40. At 60, she looked 50. The bond was powerful, extending her life far beyond normal human limits. She remained healthy and active, though she could feel age creeping in around the edges, joints that ached more than they used to. stamina that wasn't quite what it had been. Peregrym never treated her as fragile. He adjusted to her changing needs with grace, slowing his pace to match hers without ever making her feel diminished. If anything, he seemed to treasure her more as time passed, as if each day with her was a gift he hadn't expected to receive. At 73, Delilah's body finally began to fail. The bond had given her 50 extra years of health beyond normal human limits, but even vampire blood couldn't stop time forever. She developed a heart condition that no medication could fully control. The doctors gave her a year, maybe 2. Peregrym took the news with outward calm, but Delilah felt his devastation through the bond. It crashed over her in waves, grief and rage and desperate denial all tangled together. "I'm not ready," he told her that night, his voice breaking. "I'll never be ready to lose you." "I know, I'm not ready either." She took his hand, her own fingers wrinkled and age spotted against his eternally youthful skin. "But we always knew this was coming. We've had 54 years together, that's longer than most human marriages last. It's not enough. It will never be enough. Then let's make the time we have left count." They moved to the castle in Scandinavia for Delilah's final year. She wanted to spend her last months in the place where Peregrym had first shown her his whole self, where they'd talked about the future they'd have and the one he'd face without her. The northern lights were visible almost every night. Delilah spent hours watching them from the battlements, wrapped in blankets and Peregrym's arms. They talked about everything, their years together, the people they'd saved, the love they'd built from impossible circumstances. "I want you to promise me something," Delilah said one evening when her heart was particularly weak and they both knew the end was approaching. "Anything. Don't let grief destroy you. You have centuries left. Fill them with purpose like you did before me. Help people. Maintain the courts. Live, Peregrym. Really live, even after I'm gone. I don't know if I can. You can. You're the strongest person I've ever known." She turned in his arms to look at his face. "And maybe someday, centuries from now, you'll find someone else who makes you feel even a fraction of what we had. I want you to be open to that. There will never be anyone else. You don't know that. And I don't want you spending eternity alone because you're loyal to a memory. I want you to be happy, Peregrym. Promise me you'll try." He was silent for a long time. Finally, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I promise I'll try. But Delilah, understand that you were the miracle of my existence. What we had was 8 centuries in the making. There won't be anything like it again. Then carry it forward. Let what we built together continue through the work you do. That's how I'll live on, through the changes we made, the people we helped, the love we proved was possible. You're remarkable even now, even dying. You're trying to take care of me. That's what love is." Delilah died 3 weeks later on a clear night with the northern lights painting the sky in shades of green and violet. She passed peacefully in Peregrym's arms, with the bond humming between them until her final breath. When her heart stopped, Peregrym felt something inside him break so completely. He wondered if even immortality could survive it. The bond snapped like a severed cord, leaving a void where her presence had lived for 54 years. He held her body until dawn threatened, until his guards gently insisted he needed to retreat underground before the sun rose. He commissioned a tomb for her on the castle grounds, placed where she could eternally watch the northern lights she'd loved. Her funeral was attended by humans and vampires alike, representatives from every court, employees from the Foundation, distant relatives who'd known her as the mysterious woman who'd married into wealth and power. They celebrated a life that had touched both worlds and proved that love could transcend species, mortality, and logic. Peregrym delivered the eulogy himself, his voice steady despite the devastation. "Delilah Pearson was purchased at an auction for €2 million, he began. "I paid that price to set her free. What I didn't know was that in freeing her, she would free me as well. She taught me that immortality means nothing without purpose, that power means nothing without compassion, that centuries of existence are meaningless compared to decades of genuine connection. She was human and mortal and absolutely extraordinary. And she was mine for 54 years, the greatest privilege of my 800-year existence." He paused, looking out at the assembled mourners. "She made me promise to continue living after she was gone, to maintain purpose, to help people, to remain open to whatever future might come. I intend to honor that promise. The foundation she started will continue. The work we began together will expand, and every person we help will be a testament to the woman who proved that sometimes the best investment you can make is in simple human dignity." After the funeral, life became hollow. Peregrym continued his duties because he'd promised Delilah he would, but everything felt muted. Colors seemed duller. Music sounded flat. Time stretched endlessly ahead, and for the first time in centuries he understood why some immortals chose to meet the sun. But he'd made a promise, so he kept going. The foundation expanded, helping thousands of people over the following decades. The courts remained stable under his leadership. The work against supernatural exploitation continued. Peregrym became known as the vampire king who'd loved a human so completely that it had changed him forever. Decades passed, then centuries. The world transformed again and again, new technologies, new wars, new social movements. Peregrym witnessed it all with the detached patience of immortality. But there was a space inside him that remained frozen in time, still wrapped around a 73-year-old woman who'd died in his arms while watching the Northern Lights. He kept the castle exactly as it had been during their final year together. He visited her tomb regularly, speaking to her as if she could hear. He never took another consort. He never loved again. Delilah had been right. What they'd built was 8 centuries in the making, and it couldn't be replicated. But he honored her final request. He lived. He maintained purpose. He helped people. And every time the Northern Lights danced across the sky above her tomb, he felt something that might have been peace. Because she'd been worth every euro he'd paid. She'd been worth every moment of the grief that followed. She'd been worth giving his immortal heart to, knowing it would eventually be shattered. And if he had to do it all over again, knowing exactly how it would end, he would pay that price 1,000 times over. Because at the auction her price had risen fast. And he'd paid it all, not just in gold but in love, in years. In the piece of his heart that died with her. And even centuries later, alone in his castle watching the Northern Lights paint the sky, Peregrym Illyrius, vampire king of the Northern Courts, knew it had been the best purchase he'd ever made.